living arrangements. So a paper from Warwick University suggests removing restrictions on 20 to 30-year-olds who do not live with their parents, estimating this would release 4.2 million people who would be unlikely to become seriously ill and are suffering disproportionately from the lockdown.
The young are substantially the safest. The young are the hardest hit financially by the prolonged lockdown. Of course, you can have like a young-only pub, young-only restaurants run by the young, or you can have the fact that the young can do grocery shopping for the old. So you can imagine the lockdown has, maybe the effect on all three dimensions of our overall well-being. I think, we've talked to so many people already, Financial Times, CNN, and you guys.
Yeah.
And now Spicy Takes.
Well,
I mean, we beat it.
Yeah, we are the mainstream media. What can I say?
So, hello, and welcome back to the new episode of Spicy Takes. As we now head into the UK's fourth week of lockdown, it seems that the government's social distancing measures are having the desired effect. After weeks of tragic growth in the number of daily deaths, we seem to be reaching a plateau. Now, while the government's scientific advisors do not predict a diminishing of this number for a number of weeks still, and therefore the stringent measures that we are experiencing are likely to continue, Labour's new leader, Keir Starmer, is one of many calling for the government to publish its so-called exit strategy. Thus far, however, the government has been loath to publish these measures in order to reduce the possibility of disseminating conflicting messages. However, around the country, fortunately for us, researchers have been less discreet in their efforts. And it is in this spirit that we welcome our guest today, Professor Nick Powdthavee. Nick is a professor of behavioural science at the University of Warwick and author of The Happiness Equation, the surprising economics of our most valuable asset. His previous research has provided great insight into the relatively new science of happiness economics. However, last week, Nick, alongside Professor Andrew Oswald, co-authored a highly relevant and widely reported paper advocating a relaxing of the lockdown for those aged between 20 and 30 who do not live with their parents. So Nick, welcome to the show, and thank you for taking the time to speak to us in what must have been a very busy week for you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It has been quite a hectic week for both Andrew and I, actually. It's just been quite crazy in the way that our work is being taken in the media, being talked in the media, and also being discussed in by government officials about whether or not this could be a viable exit strategy. So, as you said, rightly said, Andrew and I, we wrote a paper together. Actually, we've been writing lots of papers together over the years. This is probably the shortest paper we've ever written together, but ironically, it's garnered the most attention and potential impact. And basically, we're making a proposal that when it comes to the time to start easing the measure of lockdown measure, we should start releasing, people like you guys, 20 to 30-year-olds first, who are probably not living with their parents, or actually do not live with their parents, so that they could go out and start increasing their own prosperity, can start working again, and basically start, kickstart the economy and start a mini economy, if you like, that is run for and run by the young. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's our gist of it.
Yeah, I was fascinated by it. It pertains to us, I guess, quite specifically. But just to get on kind of the assumptions of the paper more specifically, why do you think that the current lockdown is economically unsustainable in the medium term, and why would you specifically advocate the releasing of the young?
So first of all, I should say that both Andrew and I support the current government strategy, which is to try to save as many lives as possible. The fatality risk associated with coronavirus death is immediate and requires appropriately our attention. But as you and I know, we're economists. We know that currently severe damage is being done to the economy, to future incomes, to unemployment, and basically to the general livelihood of everybody. And so the lockdown can't go on forever. At some point, it has to ease, because we know that there's what we call, what I would like to call the silent killer. Things like the fatality risk associated with unemployment, with poor mental health that comes with poverty, that comes with economic inactivity. So in the long run, so at the moment, short and medium run risk is great. We need to stay in lockdown, but at some point, the long run damage will surface, and potentially that could potentially cost more lives than what we're currently experiencing now. So the logic of our argument is that since statistically speaking, the young are substantially the safest. So if you're at the age between 20 to 30, the fatality risk associated with coronavirus is 3 in 10,000. And if you move up the age range, the risk it increases almost exponentially. So it's 100 times more risky for people in their 60s. And also, the young, as a study by the IFS, which is Institute for Physical Studies, they show that the young are the hardest hit financially by the prolonged lockdown. I'm sure you all, both of you would kind of, understand that they have the lowest earning income of all age group for the people who work. Most of those 20 to 30 don't have savings. They're renters, so they stand the most to, I guess, gain from being able to go out again and start working, starting their own economy. So basically those are the two main ideas. And obviously, if you were to keep everybody locked up, not lock up, I should say, lock down much further, that's the wrong choice of word, chances are that they won't abide by the lockdown rules anyway. As you can probably see, that lots of the people who are out, majority are the young, probably just, they kind of get fed up and boredom kind of increase when you're staying at home. So you might as well, get them working and starting their own, becoming a bit more entrepreneurial. So those are the two or three main ideas that we have.
Yeah. And great, and you raise a couple of really important points regarding the inequality relations and behavioural fatigue that we'll probably touch on slightly later. But I just wanted to touch on something that you raised at the start, which is to do with the risk that these young people have. Now, as economists, how do you go about handling this delicate discussion of lives saved versus balancing the economy? Now, I know you might say that actually, the lockdown is saving lives and will therefore save the economy in the long run. But lots of people might reply to your study and say, well, there's still this risk going on, and there'll be a significant number of young people that will die as a result of this policy being implemented. So how do you navigate this sort of quite tough kind of ethical / kind of economic judgment that you're having to deal with here?
So in our study, we take the estimates from an epidemiological study that shows that, so they estimated the risk of fatality that associated with coronavirus. And we know that we take this number and we kind of weigh it against basically what are the potential number of deaths that could come the long term, that from mental health, from unemployment. And we know that to be quite substantial. We don't have a figure for it, but the studies have shown that it should be quite substantial. Now, it is delicate, I agree, and in our model, we estimated that, let's say there were 4.2 million young individuals who are not currently living with their parents. So this is estimated using the Office of National Statistics that could potentially go back to work. If half of them were to contract the virus, and let's say, given the 3 in 10,000, unfortunately, there will be about 630 estimated deaths of the 20 to 30 out of 4.3 or 4.2 million. of course, 630 is a big number in absolute term. But if we were to compare that relatively to, let's say, releasing everybody who, especially those in the risk group, or keep everybody under lockdown until Christmas. Now, the number, even though it's not as immediate, even though it's not as attention grabbing, is a lot bigger. So if you think in terms of, if you take the view of utilitarian, in the sense that you want to save as many lives as possible, then we believe that our proposed policy would produce a number that is far, far smaller of number of casualties compared to the alternatives.
All right, yeah, and I guess this is the thing. A lot of this utilitarian calculus that you're referring to it happens a lot of the time in the making of economic policy. I guess we don't see it in the same way. We were talking before about how you even have it when you set speed limits, for example. You could we could reduce the number of lives lost from car crashes if we reduce the speed limit, but there's that trade-off that you have to make with the productivity gains that you would lose out on, and then the loss in kind of quality adjusted life years that you would have from maybe not having this increased standard of living. So that's a really important point that you raise. And just touching back on something when I read over the paper, I was quite interested to see what your response to this would be. Is a potential reply to what you're suggesting is that there might actually be a regression effect if you allow, and by that what I mean is if you allow 20 to 30-year-olds to go out and just engage normally, have jobs, etc., then there might be people aged 32, 33 that get a little bit frustrated with this. I think you cite this actually in the paper. And what you might actually get is you get these sort of people that are slightly over the age boundary starting to go back to, trying to go to work or live a normal life. And then what you'll have is you'll have the 35-year-olds doing the same thing because they see the 32-year-olds doing it. And then you get to this point where you'll have this sort of almost infinite regress where people older and older are getting back. And actually you're getting to a position where it was actually quite a long way from what you were suggesting in the first place. Is this a ridiculous thing to sort of suggest, or is there a kind of better way of going about policing these sorts of kind of narrow gaps in the law that we're going to have to deal with?
Well, we are living in a very strange time, as you know, and at the moment, it's a new normal. We are already being kind of policed and monitored by police officers and officials. We're being told all the time that we are what we're doing is for the entire country. So presumably, if this proposal were to be taken literally and seriously by the government officials later, then in the way that is being administered would be in a similar fashion. So the police will still be able to check, will be able to fine people who are breaking this law. Efforts will still have to be made from the government, of course, to communicate the logic behind why we're doing this. And of course, we're all humans. We all have, emotional reactions to stuff. And you're rightly, what you said is quite correct. That 31-year-old, 32-year-old might feel, a sense of unfairness, unjust. That why are they being discriminated? But of course, what we're doing is trying to improve, to help everybody, right? Because we need to get the economy going. But you might imagine that there's little role for the older generation, so people who are above the age of 30, because they can still work in the role of supervisors, in the role of managers via Zoom, via Skype, so they can do that remotely. And both Andrew and I believe that by seeing the young taking the role of leadership, seeing the young that they actually go out and work and maybe getting open coffee shop, open restaurants, it can give hope to people. That's what we like to believe anyway. Whether or not it's going to be realized, that's another thing. But I don't know. We're quite hopeful. Another thing that I want to add to that is that, and that's a good lesson here as well, that when we try to tell people, to try to educate and communicate people that why we're doing this, there's a good lesson to be learned from research on risk literacy. I don't know have you heard of risk literacy before? But just in case people who haven't, that's a really interesting study a couple of years back by Guy Garenza, who's a psychologist, and he looked at 1 year after the 9/11 attacks, when the two planes hit the World Trade Center, and they looked at the fatality rates that are associated with traffic accident. As you can imagine, 1 year after that, there was an additional 1,600 deaths on the road in America. And that is only because people were just so scared of flying, because they're really scared of terrorist attack. But 1 year after that, the fatality rate that associated with flying commercial flights was 0. So nobody died in the year that followed that. So what's happening now is not that much different from what's happening 19 years ago. Is that the fear of the risk that associated with coronavirus is so attention grabbing, it's so immediate. We're all scared of immediate death. And then we kind of ignore the other long-term death, the long-term risk of other things that could potentially be much more harmful for us. So that is the effort for the government and scientific community to try to communicate that to people.
Yeah, those insights from behavioral economics can be so useful, really, in kind of making us make the correct decisions in our lives, when often our instincts kind of drive us to our natural impulses to kind of preserve ourselves, when it's really we can if we add some sort of rationality to the choice decision, we can often make very, very different decisions. But I just wanted to touch on a sort of slightly different segment of the argument, and it's identifying the kind of crux of your paper was identifying a demographic that is at lower risk, and therefore saying we can have some sort of staggered release of that age group into society when the timing is right. But another demographic that seems to be impacted slightly less, slightly less than by coronavirus is women. Really, the auditing institution for the intensive care units in the UK states that 72.5% of the people in critical care are men. So on this kind of topic, do you think that this phenomenon should have implications for the government's exit strategy in the future?
Well, I should say that for the young, the gap in the fatality rate between men and women is actually very, very small, probably almost non-existent. The gap gets widened as we go up the age group. So you're right, there could be potential cases that people could argue that if women after, of certain ages, let's say over 40 or 50, the rate for them, the fatality risk for them is still quite small. Could they also be released? I mean, I'm sure Andrew and I, both of us would say yes in that case. But of course, we need to look, would they go back to work? Are they already, because I don't think we have a statistic for that yet, but somebody could find out. So that could potentially be done. They could actually become supervisors, like on-site supervisors for the young, if they have the experience to do so. Now, we don't know the number for that, but yes, I would agree. It is something that we could take into consideration. Of course, the reason why we're doing all this is because you want to reduce or minimize the fatality risk as much as possible, whilst trying to maximize the probability of kickstarting the economy and increasing prosperity for the people who need it the most. And perhaps it goes back to the government as tax revenue that could be redistributed to people as well.
Yeah, thank you for that answer there. And actually, you've just kind of raised something which I wanted to pick up on, and you'd mentioned it slightly earlier, which is just maybe about policies that would supplement what you're suggesting. One of the things that I thought was maybe we would need many more youth benefiting policies to be introduced in order to realize a lot of the gains that you've discussed. Obviously, in the paper, you talked about how young people could kind of emerge with a sense of entrepreneurial spirit, start a bunch of businesses. You mentioned the coffee shops, for example. I mean, Leamington Spa doesn't need any more coffee shops, if you ask me. But I get I definitely get where you're coming from there. But it just seems to me, maybe I'm just being very skeptical about millennials and Gen Zers. The idea that they're going to just suddenly start all these businesses just seems unlikely. Maybe we'd need some more policies. For example, Will Tanner from Onward suggested a sort of transfer of shares from bailed out companies to young people to give them some kind of equity and a share in society. So we maybe might need some other policies in the mix to help with this. Is there anything that you have in mind with regards to that?
Well, I don't think when we thought about it, I mean, we kind of leave it open because there's so many possibilities that the young could contribute to the society and to the economy as a whole. I think this is more a question for you guys, really. I mean, what would you need from the government, from the companies that could help you? Should they be funding you to, come up with ideas, come up with small businesses, or could they retrain you to try to fill into the roles that at the moment is not being filled? We don't have specific answers to it. I think this is more demand led. What could I do? What do I need to basically be successful as the young generation driving the economy? Like Adam Smith says it's all that people do have entrepreneurial spirits, and I'm sure the young could potentially have that as well in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, Pran. A couple of ideas I had in my head. Firstly, I think maybe this is more broadly about getting perfect information out there in the market, but having some sort of key worker directory. Obviously, in the paper, you mentioned that workers could take up some maybe new roles, for example, in the more kind of, particularly in the supply chain aspect of industries that need it to just hold the economy together. So maybe some sort of directory, because I think a lot of young people wouldn't necessarily know what the right jobs to go into to make that impact would be. And then, secondly, I think it would be easing of credit to younger people more. I think that's a fundamental thing. A lot of young people are, getting access to a fair loan is a lot harder, I think, if you're a young entrepreneur that doesn't necessarily have experience, and in terms of not just in the workplace, but in terms of like starting a business as well. So those are the couple of things that come to mind. I'm not sure if you've got any bright ideas.
No, I think those are definitely really, really good ideas, and really I think people should have more faith in the young as well. We're living in, like I said in the beginning, we're living in such a strange time. We're being disrupted all the time. You can imagine this is a disruption to the way we work. Lots of people work from home now. Lots of people use technology, and who better to know about technology than the young, right? So I'm sure that, but the thing is, and you raised a very good point now, Tom, in a sense that at the moment the government says that we should not be talking about exit strategy. We should kind of wait, don't send out confusing statements when we want people to stay at home. I mean, I would argue, I would beg to differ and say, no, we should talk about it now, so that companies can start planning that if this is going to be the way, for the foreseeable future until a vaccine is found, if the young will be, potentially be released first, how can we benefit from that labor force? What do we need to do to help them so that we can kickstart our own business, using the youth economy?
No, I completely agree. One of the kind of ideas I was always thinking in terms of the kind of key worker directory, and this, it doesn't even have to just apply to key workers. They say like the off license down my road, that now suddenly the man can't work because he's a vulnerable individual or his workers have fallen ill. If I can put myself on some sort of database and say, like, I'm fit and healthy and I could work for your store if you want me to, and that's done on a wide scale, suddenly so many opportunities could open up where we can start opening up these businesses slowly but surely, and kind of I guess mitigate the kind of effect on their the back pocket that is happening on so many businesses around the country. So I do really value the idea, and I think it's about the implementation and kind of like the spreading of information. But kind of another topic, just moving on slightly, is, and you mentioned tech there, and who's better to use tech than children. But one bit of, I think, slightly nifty tech that we're hopefully seeing developed by NHSX, the kind of digital arm of the health service, in the coming weeks, is some sort of contact tracing app of similar to that of Singapore, which sort of lets you know if you've come into contact recently with a now symptomatic individual. So comparing this to kind of the efficacy of the policy that you've recommended, what do you think? What do you think about that policy in general? The app?
Well, I think it's a good idea, but of course, even with the track tracing technology, you need, a lot more elements to also work as well. So you can imagine there's a lag when when you find out who's being, let's say, tested positive, because there's 14 days incubation period. By the time that that somebody you've been in contact with have that, it's probably too late. In many sense, that's one problem. The other problem, of course, is that you need people to be able to sign up. I think one figure say 80% have to sign up for it to work with mobile phone.
Yeah.
So those are the two barriers. For the young, it's probably easier to kind of implement, simply because we know from evidence that the young will be fine. Almost, most of the young will be fine anyway. We have good, immune system, and they just gobble up all of this different. Well, it's not for me. I'm 40, but you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to make a joke there. I don't know. I'm not sure where to go. You're young. Come on, man.
But I'm in a riskier group age compared to you guys, right?
Yeah.
Of course, I'm not as, I'm younger than Andrew, for example. But in a way to kind of admit, if the young can go out, we don't really need so much of, let's say, we're not so worried about social distancing among the young, just as long as they don't have the contact with the older generations. Because even if they have it, they should by and large be fine. And in a way, you can imagine this proposed policy as a targeted herd immunity, if you like, right? Which build the immunity for among the young. So it's easier to monitor, because you don't have to have all of this, and it's less risky. And I think it's even better than, let's say, if you were to open up kind of by geography, because you don't know. Let's say if I live in Leamington, and Leamington is shut, but what happened if I just in the evening just drive down the road to to Tashbrook or to some other places that they're open. So I think it'll be harder, in terms of other types of exit strategy, to try to minimize the risk for the people.
I think something you and kind of that targeted herd immunity that you kind of mentioned there. I was just thinking, like, in terms of kind of chains of transmission and where this virus really spreads. What do you think about the possibility that if more young people were out and they were spreading it to each other, so it became more prevalent in that specific group, but they were still going to the same sort of grocery stores that older people still have to go to now? Do you think there might be like an increased likelihood that it will be spreading and like the virus will be present in those stores that older people still have to go to? And would that sort of necessitate a kind of like separate, maybe a youth only store that all the children or the youth that are able to go out are able to go to, whereas the older people go to that Tesco's over there? What do you think?
It could be one solution. Another, of course, you can have like a young only pub, young only restaurants run by the young, or you can have the fact that the young can do grocery shopping for the old. Right? We're running. If you go online shopping now, it's incredibly difficult, right? To be in the queue, to be, but the young can just go if they say, I am relatively risk free. I could do this for the larger group of population. Now I should say though, the policy that we're proposing is not mandatory. So for the people who don't feel like doing it, even if they're in the age group that they don't have to do it. It's up to the individual. So yeah, but no, what you said is completely correct. That it could be the young, restaurant for the young, pub for the young. I don't see why that can't be the case.
Another question I wanted to ask is regarding the now infamous kind of set of scientific advisors that are working with the government. And there was a special report out in Reuters, I think it was last week, which really gave quite a kind of devastating account of the poor management of the implementation of policy by many of the scientific advisors, and including within that many sort of behavioral scientists who have taken a bit of a sort of major hit on their disciplinary kind of operations recently. And one of the things the report found was that advisors assumed that Britain just wouldn't accept very tough lockdown restrictions. They thought that we were somehow kind of quite different culturally to a lot of the countries that had implemented these changes. And as a result of that, we wouldn't really kind of play ball with quite strict lockdown measures. I was just wondering what you made of that sort of approach, if that's borne out in the evidence, or and how, and the whole role of the behavioural science sort of unit within this within the events that have unfolded recently.
Well, so I'm part of the, I don't know if you know that there was a letter signed by behavioural scientists in the UK. So this happened before 23rd of March, before the lockdown began. So Professor Nick Powdthavee, who's one of my colleagues at Warwick Business School, helped pen this kind of open letter to the government that because originally the government was going down the road of herd immunity for the entire population, and that they were quite kind of, I guess, scared, if you like, of what we call behavioral fatigue, where if you lock people down for too long, they're going to rebel and they're just not going to do it anyway. Now, we don't have sufficient evidence of behavioral fatigue at that time, when just before the lockdown begins. So we shouldn't rely on something we don't know very well. And that's when the government received that letter, and also the letter by, I think, the UK scientists, they decided to change the strategy from just simple social distancing to the lockdown, but of course still allowing us to go out once a day to exercise and to do essential shopping. 4 weeks in, there have been, I guess, surveys and studies that I think led by scientists at UCL that shows that there's a huge rise of, I guess, boredom among us, and the people experiencing that the most are the young. There's boredom. There's I don't know. There's so many other emotions. Mental health, anxiety, depression goes up by quite a lot during this time. I think maybe suicidal thought as well. I'm not sure. And that we found even before the second of the lockdown, which is, I think, happen or about to happen next week, or if it hadn't happened already, because then we know there's 3 weeks and we have a goal in mind. But even with the goal in mind, there's already a sign of fatigue of following this lockdown order. Mm-hmm. Now we have the government come out and say, we're going to stay under lockdown for a further 3 weeks. I don't know the impact that would have on people's anxiety, people's depression, people's mental health, boredom. So we're getting close to the danger of, what we call what the hell effect. It says exactly what it says in the tin. What the hell? I don't care anymore. I'm just going to go out. So when people kind of feel fatigue, so there is this a very nice study by Dan Ariely, who's the behavioral economist at Duke, on cheating. And we know that when people kind of withheld, not trying to force themselves, let's say, not just about cheating, but let's say they go on a diet for too long, one day the fatigue will kick in and thought, I don't care anymore. I'm just gonna eat whatever I like, do whatever I like. And that could happen here. So the prolonged lockdown would have this kind of effect on people's behaviors, and that could lead to an even bigger resurgence of the infection. So we have to be careful, I think, by prolonging lockdown for too long and without giving the information about the hope and of the future.
Just actually, sorry, Tom. Just once, I just sort of something very interesting you mentioned is the impact on mental health, and I think I read one of your interviews previously, and you kind of convey these sort of insights that you can take from behavioral economics to sort of help with making better decisions in your life, and kind of not letting your emotional impulses drive you off course, let's say. So where do you think, in this sort of situation where society is, as you say, in a very troubling time, and people are left to their minds a lot of the time, what insights could possibly, I mean, it's a very difficult question to answer, but what insights from your work possibly could kind of contribute to alleviating this sort of, mental distress in people?
Well, coming back to more of my field, which is on happiness and well-being, we know that there are 3 dimensions of well-being that we kind of feed off from. So there's cognitive well-being, there's affective well-being, and there's eudaimonic well-being. So cognitive well-being is like life satisfaction. How satisfied are you with your life overall? And this is quite related to your socioeconomic status, your income, your employment status, all these kind of things. So basically is whether or not your reality meets your expectation. And then there's affective well-being, which is a day-to-day emotional health. And this is more related to how you spend your day. Right? So if you spend commuting a lot, you're going to report quite low affects. But if you're spending a lot of time socializing, talking to people, it's going to be quite high, and you're going to have a good daily emotional health. The third one is eudaimonic, which is meaningfulness, whether you feel that your life has any purpose, has any meaning. So you can imagine the lockdown has, maybe the effect on all 3 dimensions of our overall well-being. So the lockdown takes away our income for a lot of people. It takes away our job for lots of people. So obviously their cognitive well-being, the life satisfaction will go down by quite a lot because of that. They'll be worried about their income. The lockdown keeps us cooped up. We can only go out once a day to exercise. That's usually not enough to maintain a really healthy, affective well-being. And the third one is eudaimonic. By being at home and not doing much, we probably don't feel very purposeful, because when we go out to work and do all these things and study, that gives us purpose. So then we should imagine, to come back to your question, how to improve all of this. Of course, we know from the literature that staying socially connected is really, really vital for all 3. So, you guys stay connected, talking to your audience, that helps in, I guess, across all 3 dimensions. Exercise good, and trying to, tell ourselves that what we're doing has a purpose to it. It's not just, we're not doing it just for the sake of doing it. We're staying inside because we want to kill this virus off altogether, and so that we can go back to normal. So I guess there's a kind of tiny tips that I could give based on the literature.
Thank you.
Yeah, I like the idea that us doing this is a form of public service to improving the well-being of other people.
That's a lovely
thought. That's our excuse. It's for the greater good. What we're doing, and regarding boredom as well, I think if they're listening to this podcast, then that behavioural fatigue will not be a problem, because this was absolutely fantastic to get involved with and to ask you various questions and pick your brains on numerous things. I'm just going to round up now a few of the key points. I think one of the things mentioned on the inequality is really important. I think there's a lot of big intergenerational questions that are being asked more broadly anyway, regarding young people not winning things in general elections, for example, the levels of debt that a lot of us are facing, and as you talked about, the sort of stagnant incomes that are plaguing a lot of younger generations. This is part, I think, what you're suggesting, or part of a rebalancing, or at least trying to make a more just kind of social contract between the generations, what you're suggesting here. I think time will tell, obviously, on the stuff of the behavioural fatigue. This is going to be the question that I think dominates policy discussions in the next few weeks. And hopefully it's sort of these sorts of resources that people draw upon to get a better understanding of what is going on in the world, how economics and behavioural science and healthcare all sort of interlink in quite intricate and very kind of complex ways, not always complementing one another. There's often quite a lot of kind of conflicting views, one way or another, where one thing benefits in one aspect, but in another it might not work. So yeah, I just want to wrap up and say thank you so much for being a fantastic guest, and hopefully we'll be able to maybe touch base if this is implemented. We can have live reactions, updates. We can hold your feet to the fire. No pressure.
Yes, you could be one of the people we talk to. I think we've talked to so many people already. Financial Times, CNN, And you guys.
Yeah.
And now Spicy Takes. I mean, we beat
Well,
it.
yeah, I mean, we are the mainstream media. What can I say? I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure we'll be denounced by the likes of Nigel Farage eventually, sooner or later.
But yeah, thanks a lot for speaking to us. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much,
boss. Absolute legend. Yeah, cheers.
Thank you. Cheers.